Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode number 25 of the Gap Fillers podcast. My name is Michael Bradford, and let's get started here. Two major topics in the news this past week. The major one being NYC mayor election, nominating a Democrat socialist, practically communist, for the Democratic nomination. He'll go up against Eric Adams and the Republican nominee. We'll discuss that. And then we will also discuss the Senate's passing the big, beautiful bill, the omnibus bill that Trump has been trying to pass for the past few months now. Rand Paul and Thomas Massie have both been making a stand against that, and several other senators, Republican senators, have also, but it was enough to pass. And we'll also discuss the nonpartisan, air quotes, parliamentarian, and what she has been able to do basically to overhaul the bill. All right, so let's get started here. The first one I really want to talk about here is this mayor election. Okay, so we have this guy, this foreigner, Mamdani, or whatever his stupid name is. Basically, he won an election with the promise of creating a national or a socialist state, basically, in this, creating a city that is based on rent control, government-funded grocery stores, and the like. So. Basically, what this is going to do is this is going to just put the nail in the coffin for New York City. You're going to have the billionaires moving out. At least they should. I really want to talk about what the demographics of New York City have really started to look like. This is a big deal because it's a city of 8 million people, not including its metro areas of Long Island and White Plains and Newark and stuff like that. So what happens in New York City with 8 million people can easily affect any state, any given state, because if even 1 million of those people flee to a single state, that could flip and create a whole bunch of problems, like here in Florida. So I definitely want to talk about that. So basically what we're up against now is that on November 4th is the general election. And you're going to have the Republican nominee, Curtis Sliwa, against Eric Adams and Mamdani. Okay? And this is going to set up a three-way race. Basically, it's going to be a very odd race because of this. Especially because the Democrats elected or nominated such a far left candidate, whereas Eric Adams kind of functions as the moderate, and Curtis Sliwa is the moderate Republican, because pretty much every Republican that comes out of New York City is a very moderate Republican. Even Giuliani is. They run on crime, but are basically, that's their only thing. They when they actually get elected, they look very much like any typical New Yorker. So, what does this mean for Florida? This is a Florida-based podcast, so I try to keep it focused on Florida politics, if not just slightly national politics. Well, let's look at New York City's foreign-born population, shall we? So you think that people that immigrate to the U.S., you think that they'll have a slightly they would like to be here and all that stuff, which I'm sure a lot of them do, but oftentimes, especially nowadays, they come in and basically are voting for where they ran from. Okay, so if you had to take a guess, what percentage of New York City residents would you think are foreign-born? Not immigrant, not sons of immigrants or children of immigrants, but I'm saying they were born somewhere else and then had moved here. Right? I thought it may have been like 5, 10, some 15% maybe. No, it's 36%. 30% of all New Yorkers are born somewhere else. New York City, that is. Okay, so so even the children of immigrants end up moving out of New York City. And that actually made me want to. I wonder what that looks like on a national scale. Okay, so on a national scale, you actually have this this huge problem because you have this across the country, right? Almost every major city, or quite a few major cities, have this problem, right? In fact, the problem that like Miami, for instance, right? Miami has one of the highest foreign-born residency. Now, a lot of that has to do with the Cuban migration of the 70s and 80s, but what ends up happening is that it drastically shifts. It's like if things change slowly over time, there's adjustments, housing, markets, and all that stuff. But when there's a giant shift, it actually becomes an urgent matter, which is where you get the word emergency from, right? It emerges and becomes urgent, right? So it's basically a combination of the two words. So if you want to look up the top 10 foreign-born cities, you got two from Florida here, which is very interesting. And then of course you got LA and you got New York City. So if you take a city that is viewed as not a good city, practical hellhole, it usually ends up being a foreign-born city. Now, why is that? Well, firstly, is that when you have a certain expectation of, if you have a certain expectation of standard of living, like even we think standard of living being square footage of houses or how much net worth you have or something like that. But I'm even thinking about like trash cleanup or the culture, what the culture would say about in any given situation, right? If there's no acclimation, if everybody around you is from somewhere else and they all have the same lack of standard of living, then you have a major problem. So if you get the top 10 percentages, Hialeah in South Florida, which is basically it's a suburb, it's right there on adjacent to Miami. That's 74%. So 74% of Hialeah is foreign-born, which is absolutely nuts, right? That means if you lived in that city and you moved to that city because it was a nice place to grow up or whatever, that means 74% of people came from somewhere else, another country. I'm not even saying like they moved from New York, God help us, to Florida. We're talking about a foreign-born city, right? A city in the U.S. that has possible ties and allegiances to somewhere else. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that immigrants are bad, but the problem is that when you have a high population, there's no acclimation whatsoever, right? They'll stay wherever they came from, especially at 74%. Name a foreign city that's 74% American. There isn't. So the third is, or the second is Miami with 57. So over 50% of Miami is foreign born. Fremont, California, 48%. Santa Ana, California, 47%. Glendale, California, 45%. Jersey City of New Jersey, 41%. Irvine, California, 39%. San Jose, 39%. Los Angeles, 36 to 37%. New York City, 36%. You see, this is, you go down the line there, and pretty much, you got half of California cities, and a lot of those are actually fairly, they're, a lot of them are suburbs or, of Los Angeles. Some of them are. But what I'm getting at is that California is no longer a majority American state, right? Most of these people have come from somewhere else, mostly China and Mexico and South America. So you have a huge problem with people coming in and voting and becoming, and utilizing American resources. It's not like these are even the people that work on the farms, right? That's what we're always told. They're the ones that do the jobs that nobody wants. But these are in cities, mind you. These aren't these aren't people that come in. These aren't illegal. We'll get to that in a second. But that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that they come in and basically everybody else moves out, right? They're forced to move somewhere else because it is not the place that they bought their house thinking that it'll be, and so what ends up happening is that they end up being overrun. When my parents moved to Orlando in the 90s and my dad grew up here, it looked a lot different in the 60s and 70s. And I know quite a few people who have been here since that grew up here and are 80 years old, and they say it's not even close to being the same kind of Orlando or Florida for that matter that they grew up in. Now, should it always remain the same? No, things change over time. But the problem is that things should change over time because people change over time, not the people change, right? So, and it's not like not like they move somewhere else or they grew up and their kids changed and their kids change. No, for the most part, it's people coming from somewhere else and then changing, demanding that they change too, and that's what ends up happening with this. So. Why is this so important? So, New York City, all right. New York City has had examples of rent control in the past. This is highlighted in Thomas Sowell's book, Basic Economics. Right, he highlights the post-World War II boom of New York City, and basically what has happened is basically they tried to basically control the rates without expanding the supply, right? And what ends up happening is they hang on one second. They basically have created this drastic unequilibrium. Basically they knocked the equilibrium out of balance, and they have and then basically had wild swings in housing supply because people were coming back from the war and people had moved to the city to support the war economy, and a lot of the war economy was done in cities with heavy manufacturing of tanks and weapons and even supplies of any kind are almost always done in a city, especially back then with how the infrastructure was set up on still based on mostly on railways and waterways and mostly shipping overseas and stuff. So they were all basically that was what had expanded New York City. Now New York City was growing before that, but Los Angeles and California had really taken off because of World War II. So they had major housing shortages, and they tried to control for they tried to control for the price without expanding the demand, and they ended up with housing shortages and long wait times in order to bring in. Now, what also ended up happening, in fact, we run into that exact problem today here in Florida. Okay, is that when you try to control or regulate your program, what ends up happening is that instead of building standard small units, 900 square foot houses that can support a family of 3, or 1,200 square foot houses, they end up making these luxury houses and luxury apartments that are only meant to hold 2 people, but are luxury. They have all the amenities and none of the population and growth, and so they can charge thousands of dollars a month for these because they're not rent controlled, right? So you end up with a drastic difference between rent controlled and non-rent controlled properties. And so this ends up happening. This why do I get into this? Well, this is one of Mamdani's huge. This is like one of his primary things that he wants to do, and then he also wants to make government regulated grocery stores. Basically, they operate on a government fit without a profit motive. Well, guess what? Guess what you end up without a profit motive? You end up with way too much supply, and which is inefficient, or you end up with breadlines, which is inefficient, right? So what these communists never understand, right, is that when you get into certain aspects of industry, especially when it comes to food, right? They like to tout the early 1900 expansion of the Soviet Union post World War I and pre World War II as this golden year of bringing the Soviet Union, Russia, out of the czar capitalistic, which the czar was not capitalistic whatsoever, of an expanding industry, which in a sense is true, and China kind of runs into the same thing, right? Where you can produce heavy industry. Why? Because you can sit on inventory, right? You can overproduce all day long and still come out ahead, right? The problem is that you cannot do that with food. Food is this very balanced equilibrium problem that goes bad. And if it goes bad, then you can't sit on the inventory. So you can't carry, well, we made too much last year, therefore we can store it this year. Or we can not make as much this year. No, that's not how most food items work. Is you need to consistently have a balanced program of food production. And so the profit motive basically prevents overconsumption, right? By basically it doesn't encourage people to buy and hoard, right? Because you can also have fear of breadlines, right? Which means people will go out and buy, which is true. The problem is that with the profit motive in a balanced and a well trusted infrastructure of industry, you don't have that giant swing of surplus and famine. And so, in fact, we have so much food that we give it away for free, even in a profit motive, right? So we actually slightly oversupply our food supply, whether it's vegetables or fruit or even bread for that matter, right? Now, in today's economy, you can, or in today's world with science and stuff like that, you can have a lot of these artificial grains and foods that are shelf stable for an unnaturally long period of time. But this also kind of creates that bumper, right? So it gives you a little bit of in economics it's called elasticity, right? So it can flex a little bit between feast and famine. Okay, but the problem is that with these government regulated programs, either they will probably way overproduce and cost the city a whole lot more than more food than it is, or they will end up with breadlines. Those are usually the two options. The history tells us those are the two options, right? Because profit motive doesn't want you to overproduce. If I'm Publix, I don't overbuy food because if I can't sell that food within a certain period of time, it goes bad. I would be in favor of Publix doing like a surge program, kind of like they do with tolls and stuff like that, in order to sell off. In fact, that's what Walmart does pretty much, right? If you ever look at the bottom of like the expiration date on a gallon of milk between Publix, Dollar General, and Walmart, they all have different Publix will be more, but it will last longer, right? Because they bought it fresh, and they it's more it's shelf stable for longer because they have a more direct program of industry, right? Which means they have to charge more because they might have to eat a little bit more of the cost of supply and the priority shipping, right? Whereas Walmart, if you see Walmart, you'll probably have a 2-week window. And with Dollar General, you might have a 1-week window, depending on, it varies because Walmart, and these stores don't get daily shipments of milk, but that ends up being what happens is that you have a difference between, of priority between, cheap and slow with a low shelf life, or you can get it fast and expensive with a long shelf life, right? And so if you ever do that, if next time you're in the grocery store, just compare. It's a very interesting concept. Publix will almost always be more expensive than Walmart because of this. But Publix also runs a higher margin of profit margin because of that. So they have to get a higher rate. They end up getting a higher profit margin because they're focused more on quality of what they sell as opposed to Walmart quantity. Walmart has become very efficient and been able to squeeze out a lot of local grocers and the small stores because they're so cutthroat efficient. Whether it's wages or whatever, and in fact, Walmart supports raising the minimum wage to squeeze out more of their competition, even though they won't do it by themselves. So, and in fact, Mamdani was supported by one of the heirs to one of the members of the owners of Walmart, the family, supported Mamdani, which you would think is absolutely nuts, except for you realize is that first of all, these people didn't create Walmart, and they're these people that are spoiled brats that don't understand where their wealth comes from. In fact, but they won't ever just truly give it away because, first of all, giving it away would do absolutely nothing. It'd be giving somebody a meal today and letting them starve tomorrow, basically, is what ends up happening. So Mamdani, is supported by this one of the heirs to the Walmart fortune. So in doing so, she'll probably squeeze out the other grocers. In fact, one of the major supporters of the Mamdani's opponents is a grocery store magnate, John Katz. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name. He basically is trying to figure out whether he wants Eric Adams to continue or Salawi. I hate these names. Why can't they just be just regular names? And so basically he owns this supermarkets in the New York City area, right? And I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name either. It's a chain of supermarkets in Manhattan, right? And so basically he's wanting to actually have Curtis Sliwa drop out in favor of Eric Adams, and hopefully that it splits the Democrat vote and combines the Republican vote. Basically the Staten Island vote and the Manhattan vote against the Mamdani. So, which is I found pretty ironic. So you ended up with that. So you end up with price controls, and price controls lead to shortages because the equilibrium of the difference in price, and then you end up with luxury apartments and slums, and you have very few gaps in between. You can see that in Florida, like I said. So that tends to, even with how high impact fees are here. So if you look at the comptroller's report from New York City, where are these foreign numbers coming from, right? So you think just a little bit, no, it's 30%. Well, that equals about what, 3 million people. All right. So, and then almost 500,000 of these people come from, I would have thought, like Haiti or Cuba or, some like maybe a Middle Eastern. No, it's the Dominican Republic. 13% of New York City residents were born in the Dominican Republic. Okay. The second is China. Okay. Import communism, receive communism. Shocking. All right. That's 10% that's 10% of the foreign-born residents. So what is that? 3% of New York residents were born in China. All right. Then you have 200,000 from Jamaica, 180,000 from Mexico, 140,000 from Guyana. Right. These are like whole swaths of small cities. In fact, 400,000 is a fairly large city for that matter. So you end up with these non-American residents voting non-American, which is shocking because they voted for a non-American, a non-native American, native to the U.S. Candidate. He was born in Uganda to Indian parents, and then lived in South America, and then or South Africa, and then moved to New York when he was 7. Okay, and then his dad is a sociologist professor from Columbia, and so there's your key right there. And like, it's not shocking this guy's beliefs, right? 100,000 from India, 100,000 from Haiti, 140,000 from Ecuador, 90,000 from Trinidad and Tobago, which has to be like a large portion of Trinidad and Tobago. It's kind of just, you go down this line, and then you look at a lot of U.S. cities, major U.S. cities, and they're all like this as well. And it's no wonder that they're all kind of just slumps. There's no in between. You got this wide gap of expectation, right? So the population of Trinidad and Tobago is 1.4 million. All right, so you have what, a tenth of the people that live in the U.S. In New York City alone, that are for Trinidad and Tobago, that actually live in Trinidad and Tobago. So I actually found that kind of humorous. So why am I focused on this, right? So, as a Floridian, why should I care? Well, basically what ends up happening is that New York City, with its 8 million people and millions of people in the suburbs, depending on New York City, basically what ends up happening is you will end up with mass migration out of New York City. And they'll replace them, of course, with more immigrants, and the cycle will continue, right? So you'll get less people that are born in America and more people that are imported from some other, poor country and not know how to live in a first world country. All right, then you just see how people drive alone, and that's that. So you end up with, So if you actually do this, right? If you look up the difference between, I don't know, any given population or state of their current election, right? So let's go from Florida's governor election. Results, right? So if you look up the Florida governor results, right, you're gonna get really, you're not gonna get outside of 8 million people. Now, of course, you don't have 8 million people. That all 8 million people aren't going to move out of New York City into Florida, but they could move from New York City. They can move from Buffalo. They can move from Rochester, Albany, and then just so on and so on. And then you end up with a conglomeration of Democrats that have moved out of their hellhole cities, right? And then just replace them with more immigrants. Why? Because we need workers in these cities, right? Or else you'll end up like Detroit, where Detroit industry just collapsed when people moved out, and then the industry had no workers, and it becomes a cycle, right? And you can say you want more people to move in to your city, but what ends up happening is that you just don't they move somewhere else. The industry moves either overseas or the population changes. Okay, so this is actually not wanting to load. So screw you, Politico. I don't know. So what ends up happening basically is that you have wild swings in population shifts, right? Think of a culture. Think of, I don't know, what New York culture used to be, right? Or Boston culture used to be, or even California culture used to be, right? California, in recent memory, was a Republican state. Why isn't it a Republican state? Because Ronald Reagan signed an amnesty bill in the 80s, which basically gave over California to the Democrats because foreigners vote for free money and Democrats, right? So I finally brought it up. Ron DeSantis versus Charlie Crist, right? It sounds like a lot, right? 59% to 40%. Sounds like a lot, right? But that's only 1.5 million votes difference, right? And that is a very recent swing. So with you can move half of the people here, half of the people there, and then you can import more immigrants, and you end up with the same kind of problem, right? So you basically create the self-perpetuating problem. Now, what can we do about it? Well, I am definitely in favor of basically what it basically a friction. According to the 14th Amendment, you can't prevent the free movement of people from state to state, right? But what you can do, or what I think Florida should do, is make a high friction point for people to move to Florida, right? Now, we already do this a little bit when it comes to driver's licenses. If you want to register your vehicle from out of state to in-state, it is a higher fee than from in-state to in-state. Now, it's not that much when you consider how much of the how much money it costs to move. You're probably not thinking about that much, right? But there should be, we can start up fiddling with different ideas to basically prevent high fluctuations of population into Florida. Florida is already the third highest population state, but it is only in the middle when it comes to land area, right? So of course you got a lot of western states, but if you want to preserve what Florida is with its beaches, and its swamps and its lush wildlife and stuff like that, what it has left, if you want to preserve the Everglades, you need to reduce the population growth at least by a little bit, or you need to prevent people from coming in and voting in bad policy, right? So how do you do this, right? One of them would be a version of housing restrictions, right? So if you want to come and buy a house, there is a fee for out-of-state residences, right? Or make a large fee to become a resident of that state, right? So you either have to live here for a certain amount of years to become a resident, 5, 6, 10, whatever. And then you also and then to buy a house or to skip that process and buy a house, because if you buy a house, you technically have to, or you're technically going to be if you're going to be a resident of that house, maybe have a large fee on it, say $10,000-$20,000. And what that would do is you can either fund that into a sovereign wealth fund for the whole state, or you can basically or you can hinder people in doing so. So I think that would be a good idea. Or you can make tax breaks for people who live here, so you don't get squeezed out by people with high standards of living and high CPI of their dollar is actually worth less in New York City. So it would be actually more profitable for them to move out of New York City with their dollars. Mississippi has one of the lowest CPI, right? Which is, it's not a standard of living really. It is the value of the dollar in in a state or in an area, right? So it's not even so. If you think about it this way, right? If it costs you a dollar to buy an apple in New York, it can cost you 85 cents to buy it in Mississippi. Well, if you export all of your dollars and to live in Mississippi or to live in Florida, you can then out purchase everybody else's apples, and you can get a 15% saving, 20% savings on your dollar by moving it out of New York City. It's now this happens everywhere else. This is why this is why corporations and stuff like that move their businesses and production to out of the country, because it's even worse. I mean, you're talking about triple to quadruple the rate of basically the value of capital in foreign countries. This has a lot to do because of the lack of capital in the excess of human capital, right? Like the Congo. It is cheaper to pay people very minimum wages because you have a ton of people, and that's how that works. But it would cost a lot more to bring in an excavator to replace all those people, and then you have to get all those you have to get infrastructure there, and so it's actually cheaper in the short term to pay very, very basically like starvation wages to a ton of people. And so, Florida or the U.S. doesn't really have that problem overall. But what it does have is it has a very drastic difference between the, let's say, buying a house in New York City, Long Island, whatever, Queens, and then buying a house out in, rural South Carolina, right? And so that's basically how that works. And that's why BlackRock and, all these other State Street and Vanguard are able to buy up areas of the country. And even China's able to buy up farmland in the country because it's farmers make a certain amount and can't outbid somebody from New York City, a mega corporation in New York City. And so when they come in and buy up a lot of land, it makes their value go up, which makes their taxes and the cost the CPI increases even a little bit can outcompete a lot of people, because a lot of businesses operate on a 2 to 10% margin of profit margin, and if they lose that, even with a small swing, you can put a lot of people out of business. This is why inflation is bad, especially for small producers that don't operate heavily on debt or don't have a lot of assets to leverage. A lot of big corporations, they operate on debt, and inflation actually helps debtors. This is why you have to increase this is why one of the reasons you have to increase the interest rate in order to decrease the inflation, because you basically increase the cost of borrowing, which outpaces inflation. And basically what you want to do is you always want to have inflation a little bit less than, or interest rates a little bit less than inflation, so you can make both people can make money, right? If inflation outpaces the interest rate, I'm not going to loan you money, and if the interest rate outpaces inflation, I'm not going to borrow money. And so you need a very close equilibrium between the two. Okay, so different ways you can do this. Now, one thing I'm definitely in favor of is a probationary period for voting rights, right? Like I said, 6 to 10 years of permanent residency. So you can't live here as a snowbird and be able to vote in Florida. That's a no-go, right? You have to live here long term for a certain number of years. And that enables you to vote, right? Now, why do people do this, right? Okay, so people will live in Florida, but live somewhere else, right? They'll reside in Florida. They'll have their residency here. Why? Because they're not taxed, right? We don't have a state income tax, so it doesn't matter if you're living here, as long if you're in the state and you're spending money. That's when you're taxed. Now, what does that hurt? I've said that before. I know this is kind of a refresher for some people, some listeners, is that you end up having this problem between the two, right? You have people living somewhere else but holding assets in Florida, right? And those things are taxed at a certain rate, but they're also using a certain number of resources, no matter if they're living there or not. And that's also why I would favor a raising of the Homestead Act, the homestead exemption rate, and then leveraging more of the debt or more of the tax burden onto non-residences. So if you're not living here, you are going to be paying more, and that will help bring in capital to Florida instead of letting capital flow out of Florida, because of our favorable tax policies. So now, what are some hurdles against this? Well, it's the 14th Amendment, right? Basically, the 14th Amendment basically allows the equal application of law no matter what state you're in. So if I'm going to charge you in New York with a certain thing, but you live in Florida, you have to be given the same rights, right? You have to have, trial, the certain, the certain rights guaranteed by the Constitution. Trial by jury and all that fun stuff. If you're charged with a crime in that state, and then you have it guarantees all states to be a republic. Republican form of government, which means you elect representatives, stuff like that. So, but it also there's also a clause that prevent. So basically, if Florida enacts this, I highly doubt the U.S. the federal government under Trump, the Attorney General will bring up a case against Florida, but some other a private like ACLU will probably bring up a file a lawsuit against Florida, and if they do that, then I would also bring up Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution. Did I say amendment? It's the Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution. So I would also invoke the fourth article of the Constitution that prevents that it guarantees all states to be protected from invasion. So if they do that, basically you create a poison pill in which you basically accuse the federal government of being null and void, of not protecting Florida and Florida residents against illegal immigration and therefore an invasion. Basically you would create this lack of legitimacy of the U.S. federal government in doing its job. This and force the courts to make a ruling on what may or may not be done to prevent an invasion, and it might help the other U.S. states that are fighting illegal immigration. And then it also might force, under the supremacy clause of, basically it makes the federal government over the state government. One overrules the other. Basically, it would force California to have to obey the U.S. law, which is actually in Article 4 of the Constitution. So no more sanctuary cities, no more. Oh, we're just not going to help you. Help the federal government deport these illegal invaders. Okay, and then this is actually something Trump brought up, or one of his high-ranking officials brought up today, which I highly support, is not counting anybody that's not an official U.S. citizen in the census. I think it's absolutely nuts that we do, right? This will, and then I'm also for a moratorium on immigration, but I digress from that for now. So yeah, there's that. So but that's basically what I want to lay out today on that one. particularly because of the outflow that's going to happen of New York City residents. It may not happen immediately. It may be a slow burn of 10 years. California didn't immediately die in 1980. But its death started, and that's how these places work. Unless there's a massive shortage of stuff, then the trickle ends up being slow, right? That's how it happened in Germany, from Germany to America. That's Italy to America. And not everybody hopped on a boat and came over to the U.S. all at one time, but there was a gradual, consistent flow out of Germany, out of Italy, out of the Balkans, and into the U.S. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about, let me bring that up here, is the big beautiful bill, or which I hate calling it. It's the U.S. omnibus spending bill for this year, right? It passed the House with certain good things in it, deregulation of gun laws in the NFA, which I highly support. But the parliamentarian, the unelected Senate parliamentarian, under the Byrd rule, struck down the gun law deregulation. Now, why did she do this? Well, she basically claims that doesn't have to do directly with a budget, right? However, in particularly gun silencers, they are in particularly a budget item. Why? Because there's a tax stamp that goes with every silencer. Now, if they can't, because of certain rules, then get rid of the tax stamp altogether, and that will delist. That will be the way to get around that rule, because it is legitimately it's called a tax stamp. It has to do with the rules of taxation and debt and federal spending. Okay, and that's why this the big beautiful bill only needed 51 votes to pass instead of the usual 60, which I can get into later, or I'll answer any questions that are brought up on that. Mike Lee brought up a very interesting concept. He wants to sell hundreds of thousands of acres of public land, most of it under the Forest Service, and the BLM management. This will target about 11 million acres in western states. I've been in favor of this in the past, and I really do largely support selling off public land. I do understand that you don't want to sell public land to public corporations. In fact, that's basically been a large part of what happened in previous selling of public lands, post-Revolutionary War, post-Civil War with land grants and stuff like that. Even pre-Civil War, after the U.S. defeated Mexico in the Mexican War, and stuff like that. So they sold them off to these railroads, and basically that's how a lot of these small towns have popped up because of land grants. And these land grants acted as middlemen. Now, these wouldn't be land grants; they would be selling. Now, I also think that BlackRock and all these big developers wouldn't like this, because it would also degrade the asset value of their current holdings. And so I think that actually might be a red herring that a lot of people have, that they might be actually behind some of the push to not sell off these land grants, because you can just as easily say you sell them to the states, right? And the states can determine what to do with them, or you can sell them to private individuals at a certain market rate, at a certain per acre, and prevent corporations as a whole from buying these, right? You can definitely add in some provision that will prevent a large corporation from buying these lands. Okay, but just out ruling out that that the federal government must own millions of acres of land is absolutely nuts. I also think this might be a thing with in particular the BLM, which has to do a lot with ranchers and stuff like that. Ranchers lease BLM and Forest Service land in order to graze their cattle without the having to own and be taxed on the land themselves. So they'll lease. So this actually happens in Florida, where a lot of these wildlife management areas are former ranches and current operating ranches, but they're owned by the state in order to be in order to be under government jurisdiction for land and water usage, but also they sell it back or they lease it back to the rancher at a dollar value. So $1 per year or something like that. So it's a bet. The state gets what they want and the rancher gets what they want. So that probably has a little bit to do with it. I highly doubt that the federal government needs to hold on to 80% to 90% of Nevada, which is what they currently own. The federal government owns 80 to 90% of all acreage in Nevada, and then a lot of these western states are the same. Now, a lot of this is desert land. If it becomes a water rights problem, that might be a different story. There's a way to develop it, is what I'm saying, though, without actually having to be a huge problem. Okay. Then federal employee pensions and the overhaul was nixed, but that was mostly because it was unpopular between the moderate Republicans that wanted to keep on spending. And then there's two more things. The CFPB, which is basically it's a credit bureau kind of thing. It stands for, let me bring that up. I had it just here just a second. It stands for Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, right? So this kind of they create different regulation to protect consumers from unfair, deceptive, or abusive practices. That's a quote. And then it was instituted under the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, why this doesn't apply to it's not actually defunding them, or it's basically combining them into a different. Basically slashing 70% of their funds. Now, that's a direct budget rule, right? That's a spending rule, which would allow it to be under the parliamentarian rules or the Bird rule or whatever this stupid idea is. And it really stinks when you have a divided Republican Party that can't ever agree on anything, but as soon as you get Democrats, they can march in lockstep and then include things that under the Bird rule would be not allowed. It's just like federal judges and stuff like that. It's saying that the Senate parliamentarian is nonpartisan. It's just like saying the Supreme Court is nonpartisan. Let's all kind of grow up here and realize that everybody is biased, right? Especially on the Supreme Court, everybody likes to pretend like their person isn't biased, and then everybody else is, right? So you obviously have conservative judges, and you obviously have liberal judges, and you also have one idiot Roberts and stuff like that. And so the CFPB budget cuts were blocked by the parliamentarian under the Bird rule because she basically put it under the Federal Reserve's funding mechanism, which means which doesn't make any sense because the Federal Reserve would also be under the Bird rule. So, because it has to do with monetary policy and funding, okay. So the last thing it did is the one of the more unpopular things about the bill that people didn't realize until it passed the House was the AI regulation override, right? So basically, it used the supremacy clause, basically that said states and municipalities cannot, make regulation on AI from 10 years. Now they cut it down to 5 years, and also made ways for them to make child safety and personal likeness rules in states. Now, I'm still firmly against that. I'm not pro zoning laws, but I'm also not pro, building up, a massive factory in front of, tearing down industry or tearing down forestry to build whatever you want. Anyways, so those are the two things I want to talk about. I'll talk about salt later. That basically is connected to New York. Gives them a big old, platter of food on that one. But thank you for joining me this week. If you want to support the podcast, you can subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on Spotify. Click the bell so you never miss an episode. Follow me on X at GapFillers1776 or on Facebook at Florida Gap Fillers Podcast. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me. Have a